Hi there. So today's module is about psychoanalysis, and psychoanalysis is one of the other methods you can use for your contextual essays. And of course, we know that psychoanalysis by some has been referred to outdated, right? And I'm certainly aware of that. But in terms of art history, it's important to discuss it. So we have that. So some of the psychoanalysts are Freud, Winnicott, and Lacan. Psychoanalysis we define as the unconscious significance of works of art. And even though, some art historians would think this is out of date, it's still very much so practice. It involves the artists and their art, the aesthetic response of the viewer, and then of course the cultural context of it. It can be integrated with iconographic methods, feminism, Marxism, and semiotics. And I think that's where it really becomes successful. In spite of its problematic nature, just in general, especially with Freud, if you're combining it with other contextual studies, it can be done in a successful way. So psychobiography examines the artist's psychological development in relationship to his art. Psychoanalysis, the basic concepts is we have the psychosexual stages of the oral, anal, phallic, and genital. They believe that creativity is fueled by instincts which have an aim, i.e. sexual or libidinal and or aggressive. And then the object, which is the person or the thing to which the aim is directed towards. And then we have sublimation and unconsciousness. So we know that some, for example, in surrealism, will have a lot of unconscious production. Somebody like Salvador Dali that claims to be in some sort of trance when he produces art. So those are examples of that. In terms of psychoanalysis, we have the Oedipus complex, which is a biologically determined mental construct. At the core of childhood development, we begin in the anal stage and ends with the phallic. And this is referred to as the exclusive attachment of the boy child to the mother, which involves the elimination of the father, giving away to what's called the castration complex. And I'll talk a little bit about that at the end of the lecture. So we have a positive Oedipus complex, which gives way to heterosexual male, whereas a negative leads to the homosexuality. And of course, I'm very aware that these are problematic terms and issues in terms of gender theory, right? Which would be, of course, another approach to art history. I did want to talk a little bit about, for example, Donatello's David from 1430. So many times when you're taught this artwork in your survey courses, there's a tendency to ignore the homoeroticism of the work. So if we were going to talk about psychobiography and the fact that Donatello was a homosexual man living in the Renaissance, where homosexuality, specifically sexual encounters with men, were illegal, we can see that this is a very interesting work, right? So this is Donatello's David. This is a black and white photo, and you're looking at the front and the back. From just looking at it, we can tell that he's very effeminate, right? So David is represented in an effeminate way. He has what's called a petasus, which is his hat. He's wearing greaves that protect his shins, so there's shin guards. He has a sword, and he is standing on Goliath's head. So this is in the story of David and Goliath. This is the part where Goliath has already been decapitated, and he's standing on the head of the giant Goliath. And then we have a wreath, which is the victor's wreath, that he's also standing on. And, one of the reasons he's so effeminate is because the face is based on a classical work Roman work known as Antinous. And Antinous was Hadrian's gay lover, and the faces are very similar. So we know that Donatello would have been using this work, as a source for the face. And here you can see a little bit better the petasus, the ribbons, and of course the face. And this David, I should clarify, is closer to the narrative in the Bible, as opposed to Michelangelo's David that is much older. The narrative of the Bible does state that he's younger, that he's small, weak. Okay. And here in the detail of the sword, you can see that it's quite bulbous, right? And it's phallic in nature. especially the way he's grabbing it. And you can also see his buttocks here. So I will be talking about things that might make you uncomfortable, so trigger warning. Another issue, of course, is this homoeroticism, right? So besides the fact that this is a very phallic sword, you have that, in a sense, the toes of David are caressing the beard of Goliath, right? So there's this sensuality to the work that is often ignored in survey classes. And there's lots of research supporting this, specifically Antinous, right, which is the Roman source for the face, and then of course the sword, and I'll show you more details in a minute. There's been also discussion of primary sources stating that Donatello would chase his apprentices with his Pinello, and this is a primary source talking about, puns, right? Puns in the Renaissance. And Pinello happens to be paintbrush, but it also is slang for penis. So there's primary sources of the time saying that Donatello would follow around his apprentices with, i.e., his paintbrush. But the problem with that, translating it literally, would be that Donatello is very much so a sculptor. So it's certainly hinting towards his homosexuality and his love for young boys. And also within the context of the production of this work, the Medici are believed to be the patron of this work. And also we have primary sources that talk about, if your child is sick, make sure that a Medico, not a Medici, comes to visit them, because the Medici were seen as lascivious and often, having relationships with young boys and enamored of young boys. And I'm speaking of young boys specifically because that's the documentation. So we do have that the patron is also connected to this. We believe that this sculpture was displayed in the Palazzo Medici in the courtyard for a wedding. And it was kind of like a very fancy sculpture. Instead of an ice sculpture, it was in a table, and it was surrounded by food, and it was instead made in bronze. There's another art historian that has talked about how, because homosexual relationships were, even though it was illegal, right? Lots of men had homosexual relationships before marriage. So if in fact this was used as a marriage, in a marriage, it would be kind of a way of saying bye to your previous life, in which you had relationships with men and then having a heterosexual relationship with a woman after marriage. So there's an article that talks about that. So let's look at some details. Some people, of course, are always in disbelief about this reading of this sculpture. And I think that the wings of Goliath's helmet is quite telling. That's coming inside and tickling the interior of the thigh. And it's very titillating. These are, so I know they're old pictures, but they're mine. And then there's a detail here on the helmet, and you can see that we have little Cupid figures, are known as Amorini. And Amorini are playing with a chariot. They're playing with, they're playing with a chariot, and they're playing with armor. And it's this idea of a homosexual relationship between David and Goliath, that in a way his decapitation is sexual. And I'll be talking about that in a minute when I talk about Caravaggio. So these are things to think about. And again, for the test, I would want you to know that it's homoerotic, that it's patronized by the Medici, that Donatello was himself homosexual. And this would be a biographical reading based on primary sources, in which, the homoeroticism would be connected to the biography of the artists. So again, think about it and let me know if you have questions. Things that are important, of course, it's that it's a nude, full-size nude, that it's in contrapposto, and that it's highly sensual. So if we looked at it from the back, which I'm showing you here, it could be mistaken for a female, which is also another aspect of the work that many art historians find interesting. So Caravaggio was also homosexual, and now we're in the Baroque period. And this is his David with the head of Holofernes. And again, the issue of decapitation from a psychoanalytical point of view would have to do with castration anxiety. This is an important work because this is the work he sends to be pardoned for the murder. He had committed murder, and he submits it to the cardinal and the popes in Rome so he could come back. He never makes it back. He gets sick on the way to his return to Rome. But because there was a price on his head, i.e., dead or alive, he sends this painting in which David is holding the head of Holofernes. And excuse me, that's a typo. It's Goliath. It's Goliath again. It's the same subject, so I apologize. So this is when he shows his self-portrait as Goliath. So instead of picking the hero, David, he picks the hero, the anti-hero. And you can see that it is a self-portrait of Caravaggio. You can see his eyes that are characteristic of him. They bulge a little bit. And then his teeth. You have the blood spurting out, and then you have the positioning of the sword, again, which is very, very phallic, just like we saw in Donatello's David. We have things that are very much so Caravagesque, which are the tenebrism, the sharp contrast between light and dark. And a lot of people always think, well, why is he representing himself as the anti-hero? And that's really how he saw himself. So a lot of art historians have psychoanalyzed him again as a homosexual man in Counter-Reformation Italy. How did he function within society? What does his paintings reflect this? So there's been a lot of discussion about this. And in other works, for example, which he represents his lover dressed as Bacchus, again, this idea of, can we read through the artwork, right, the psychobiography of the artist? And of course, with a word of caution, always have primary sources, always look at the patron, where the work was used. I wouldn't use the psychobiography just on its own. You have other elements, which, for example, contextualism, gender theory, to help you sort of sort through the material and produce a really good research paper on any of these subjects. And again, I apologize for the typo. Then we have Caravaggio's Head of the Medusa, and this is an interesting work too, because he is showing himself again as a monster, and not only a monster, but a female monster. So we know Medusa was a very attractive woman who had a relationship with Poseidon. She's punished by the gods to have snake hair and to turn people into stone. So Caravaggio is using this particular symbol as a self-portrait, right? So you can recognize his eyes again, his teeth, the blood, and he uses really interestingly, right, the circular format. When you watch this in person, look at this in person, excuse me, at the Uffizi, it's very three-dimensional. It's quite spooky. And it's in the form of the shield, a shield that you would use, again, in antiquity, it would be known as the Gorgon head or Medusa. Remember that Perseus decapitates her, again, the act of decapitation, and then retains the head so he can turn monsters into stone. And what I think is interesting, again, based on all the research out there in art history, not only castration anxiety that equates to decapitation, right? And again, his homosexuality, but the fact that in this case, he's using the Gorgon head, and the Gorgon head is seen as a apotropaic image. So apotropaic means to ward off evil. So we know that the Gorgon head was used in shields. We know that Athena used the Gorgon head also, and it was to ward off evil. And interestingly enough, the Gorgon head is associated with what's known as, because she has big teeth, if you look at it in antiquity, especially in Greece, with what's known as the vagina dentata, or the vagina with teeth, which again is another scary concept that Freud talks about for men fearing women and being possessed by women and the sexuality of women. So if you looked at my feminist discussion, again, it's sort of full circle. Where are these myths coming from, right? So are they coming from this fear of women? So certainly if you were to research Caravaggio or Donatello, the biography is important, gender studies is important, and if you're using psychoanalysis, again, be cautious of what exactly you're saying. So certainly wanted to give you a little bit of information as you are preparing for your writing your papers. Thank you so much. Email me with any questions or concerns.